When God of War Ragnarök released, it got incredible praises from fans and critics alike, me included. I even remember talking about it in my New Games of 2022 video. Please do not watch that video, the audio quality is actually horrible. I have no idea why I uploaded that video. At the time, while I did have some issues with it, in general I did really like the game. It has some incredible moments, some incredible gameplay improvements, so who cares about those issues? They're not a big deal, right? I was kind of just trying to ignore them in favor of the things that I liked. But to this day, I'm often still thinking about this game. But usually if a game is memorable enough to still think about it a year later, it's because I started to appreciate the game more as time went on, or because the game really left an impact on me. But with Ragnarök, I just get more conflicted, and the more time goes by, the harder it becomes for me to look at this game in a positive light. Even if it definitely did leave an impact on me, or even if it still has all of those elements that I absolutely adore, those moments are just kind of being overshadowed right now by the glaring issues that I tried to ignore at first. So I thought, fuck it, I actually need to take a look at this game. Look at the things that I love, but also look at the things that bother me, so I can make up my mind. Does it really deserve the praise that I gave it at first? Or does it deserve to be looked at more negatively, as I've kind of been doing lately? I honestly have no idea, so let's take a look at this game and see if I can make up my mind about it. And while I do that, why not quickly press the like and subscribe button for more content like this? I would really appreciate it. But I'm gonna start off by talking about the things that I didn't like as much. My main criticism of this game would probably just be that it's not really a tight-knit experience. A lot of the plot feels really messy, and when you look at the bigger picture, taking all of the aspects into account, from character writing to story writing to continuity, gameplay, pacing, side content, it all feels a little disjointed. Ragnarök tries to do a lot of things, it tries to focus on a lot of things, but because of that, it kind of falls flat and it loses that focus. The game just doesn't really take its time to build up to satisfying conclusions, which is pretty important since this game is set out to end the Norse saga, which is another point that I don't really like about this game. The fact that it sets out to conclude this saga, while not really doing that at all. But I'll get into that specific criticism a bit later into the video. First, I want to focus on the bigger picture, on why this game just felt kind of messy, especially compared to God of War 2018. In that game, the focus was simple. It's about a relationship between Kratos and Atreus, a broken family coming together as they travel through the land. And everything in that game is carefully crafted and is there to serve that. It was like a puzzle where every piece fit perfectly. Basically every scene, every line of dialogue, every quest, everything connects to this core purpose and has meaning to it. That game takes its time with the plot lines. It takes its time introducing us to everything, to the world, to the characters, to the plot lines. It gave everything depth before then moving towards a climax for that chapter. While Ragnarök just can't reach its climax fast enough, even though it didn't do anywhere near enough build-up, and outside of a few plot lines, they're not given any depth. Gameplay-wise as well, there are a lot of things in this game that feel like they're included for the sake of it, not because they strengthen the core message or the goal of this game. But let's start off by talking about the story first. The first game was a pretty small-scale adventure, so I get that the second game had to expand its scope, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. The problem is that Ragnarök kind of just loses its focus while doing so. It's really weird because this game drags out certain parts, like to the point that you're thinking, why is this section so long? Why are we still doing this? But at the same time, it would take other plot points and just speed through them as fast as possible. It's really like the game is just fighting with itself about what it wants to focus on. And because of that, I just think that this game should have been 2 games, and the Norse saga in total should have been a trilogy, with maybe the second game focusing on Kratos and Freya, while Atreus is off doing his thing in Asgard, and the third game would be the final preparation for Ragnarök, and of course Ragnarök itself. But now, because the game tries to tackle all of those things and more, it really just feels like it's two games that were mashed together, and because of this it falls flat in many aspects. Like, the whole Freya arc starts off really strong. On paper her arc is also pretty good, but near the end of it, it kinda just fumbles the execution. Once she joins your party, her character kinda just disappears into the background, and she turns into this husk that tells you how to solve every puzzle the second you step into a room. Don't get me wrong, she has some fantastic scenes, especially early on in the game, like when she's at the campfire with Atreus, but it feels like at a certain point very early on in the story already, they're just like, okay, we need to hurry this up, because for the second half of the story, she's gonna have to be on our side. So she's gonna attack you, you're gonna have a boss fight, then you're gonna go on a mission together, and she's your friend now. She's gonna forgive Kratos, time to join the party and become a background character, which is especially drastic when coming from God of War 2018, where they really took their time with character arcs like this. Freya going from wanting to kill Kratos to forgiving him for killing her son should be a massive deal for her character, and while the moments in a vacuum are pretty good, it feels like we're going over this very fast. Because, as I said, it's literally just, she hates you, you go on a mission together, she's your friend now. And then you have Freyr and his crew, who might not be the worst offenders to these problems, but their entire existence is really weird, as they're portrayed to be important, but at the same time they barely get any screen time or depth, and they just feel out of place because of this, or also just because of the way that they're written. So they do highlight a lot of these problems. Freyr as a character is just really strange. The best way to describe him is just that he's a shit MCU character inside of a God of War game. He's supposed to be, or he's set up to be, this super charismatic guy that created peace between the elves who were literally at an eternal war. But instead of making him an actual charismatic guy, he's just an idiot that won't stop making shit jokes. He's the opposite of what you'd expect from him, and he actively made me dislike scenes with him in it. And then you have his crew, who are just kinda there. Besides for the blacksmith, they don't really have any personalities or screen time, which is a shame, because on paper there are a lot of cool concepts here. There's a dark elf and a light elf and stuff like that, but they don't do anything with it. It feels like originally they really planned to do a lot more with them, but because it's two games that were mashed into one, that's just one of the pieces that fell out of the pile. Because there is this scene later on where they're escaping from an enemy base, and one of the characters from Freyr's crew sacrifices himself. It's this really drawn out, dramatic scene where the camera pans away from Kratos to show him slowly walking through the chaos. The sounds of war get toned down, emotional music starts playing, and then he throws himself off the boat, sacrificing himself. It's shown as it's trying to be this really emotional and impactful moment, but I was just there like, who is this guy? Like, yeah, I know him, he's part of Freyr's crew, but I don't know him. I don't even know his name. It feels like this entire crew and him was supposed to be more important in the original drafts, and this scene somehow just made it into the final product. He doesn't actually die with his sacrifice though, as you find him later in a side quest, where everyone is really happy that he survived and he's alive, but then he also doesn't show up again. So what was the point of, one, his sacrifice, and then what's the point of bringing him back? It's such a mess. The same can be said about a lot of other side characters as well, like this friend that Atreus makes in Asgard. He shows up like once when you enter Asgard and you're climbing the wall, and then in the next Asgard section, Atreus is acting like he's one of his best friends now, and he keeps talking about him, he keeps bringing him up. Like, sure, I guess he was there and he was chill for the 5 minutes that we saw him, even if we didn't even really see him, he was just at the bottom of the wall screaming up. But I guess he was chill for that section, but we don't see him afterwards, we don't hear him afterwards, and then apparently they're just really good friends there. It makes sense in a way because Atreus spent a lot of time in Asgard. I guess he then also spends a lot of time with him, but we don't see any of it. All of it is off screen and we hear about it instead of actually experiencing it ourselves, even if we have Asgard sections. The gods in Asgard also have something similar in that they just don't get the time that they need or deserve. The plotline of Sif and Trude losing trust in Odin, then betraying him in the end to join our side, it's all there and that idea is really good. But it's never really a focus on the game, while it just should have been. Ideas like this being included is also why I'm so conflicted on this game, because that's honestly a fantastic plotline, but they don't explore it enough. This is part of what God of War is about. They're the gods that Kratos is going up against, and them switching sides should be extremely important. These are characters whose choices carry a lot of weight, but it's all handled as a side note. You get most of this plotline through optional dialogue that's presented through you eavesdropping on them. Outside of Thor, they don't really get anything. They don't even get a conclusion in the end. All you get is that you can talk to them as NPCs that are standing around in the final section of the game, even though they're a really big factor of what decided this outcome, which is actually what a lot of characters have now that I think about it. Well, everyone's conclusion is really good on paper. We kinda just skip through most of it until we reach the final cutscene with Kratos and Atreus, which is finally where the game takes its time again. Besides that, the game also has a lot of really strange coincidences and really weird pacing, like how they just randomly find Odin's noose laying around. This is the thing that's the weakness of our main villain, the thing that they need to basically stand a chance against him, and they just randomly find it here and they just take it with them as a surprise tool that might help them out later, wink wink. It's so weird how this noose is handled in the game, especially because the noose is basically the exact same concept as the arrow piece in God of War 2018. It's an item that they find early on in the game, so it can help them out in the end. But where here they just find it randomly out of nowhere and they put it in their pocket for later. In 2018 they get the arrows gifted to them, they use an arrow piece to fix Atreus' post trap. Later Freya takes the arrows away from you because it's of course the weakness of her son, but she doesn't think about the small arrow piece in the strap, just like we aren't thinking about it. And then in the final battle, that small piece from the scene that was basically just a really nice moment between Kratos and Atreus, a moment where Kratos was teaching Atreus a lesson, that comes back in the end to win the final boss basically, by that item being placed there earlier in the game. Nobody thought about it anymore, it was just a thing, it happened naturally, it was naturally being set up throughout the game. While this is literally just, oh, a noose, let's take it with us, this will definitely help us later. And this is what I mean with weird coincidences just happening because they have to happen, and plot devices being placed into the story in a really unnatural way. And when I'm talking about the pacing, you of course have the infamous scene with Angrboda and Atreus, but I'm not gonna rag on that scene, that's been happening enough on the internet. A section to me that kind of stands out as strange is how the entire Searcher section is done, because once the characters decide to track down Searcher, because that's something that has to happen, you just kind of find them chilling somewhere, you fight a mob of normal enemies, you go to the edge of time, he goes into a special form, and you're done. On to the next plotline. And all of this happens in a span of like 15 minutes, by the way. I know that these are all pretty small things if you look at them like that, but there are a lot of these small things. If it was just one or two things like the noose or like Freyr's screw, then sure, no game is perfect. But it's not just a handful of things. As I already mentioned, it's Freya, her brother Freyr, his screw, Thor's family, the people living in Asgard, Searcher, Skoll and Hati finding the noose, the Norns as well to a certain degree. And while I could go on and analyze even more examples, you probably get the point by now. With so many things, it feels like the game is going from event to event to event, as if they just had a checklist of things that had to happen, instead of actually exploring these important events and turning them into arcs when necessary. They just get all of them over with as fast as possible and they move on to the next thing, which is especially bad for a finale to a saga. Thankfully, the arc that Kratos and Atreus went on were done really well. Like, Kratos' journey is still fantastic, but so many side characters and subplot lines were just done dirty. Like I mentioned earlier with the Norse gods, most of the characters just get a few lines of dialogue to conclude their story. The only characters that really get a worthy conclusion are, again, Kratos and Atreus. And while their conclusion was done really well, this game is about a lot more than just them. It tries to do a lot more than 2018 2018 by focusing on all of these characters. But that's the thing, it tries to, and the other characters and their plotlines are a good example of where that attempt falls flat, and where the focus just becomes a mess. And even if they do get their own cutscene, like Freya or Angerboda, they don't really get a conclusion to their character. But I'll come back to that later. For now, I'll just say that, in my opinion, a lot of these characters deserves a lot more. Again, especially for a so-called conclusion. So many plotlines were seemingly scrapped, even if they had a lot of setup done. Others were just rushed through completely, even if they were set up to be a lot more. Even if they needed to be a lot more. It feels like there was probably a lot more planned for them as well, but since they decided to wrap up the Norse saga in this game, I'm guessing they just didn't have the time, and it all ends up as a missed opportunity at best, or messy and rushed plotlines, inconsistencies, and plot devices as literal devices, or characters that become plot devices at worst. But the biggest victim of this, in my opinion, was actually the most important of them all, Ragnarok. While playing the game, this was definitely my biggest disappointment, where my other criticisms come more from looking back at the game. Right after finishing that sequence, I genuinely just disliked it, outside of a few story points. It was just extremely underwhelming. This is the sequence that the entire game was building towards. It's a sequence that the entire saga was building towards. It's in the title of the game, but it was barely even an hour long. And while pure time spent doesn't really matter, you can keep it short if that's all the time you need, then that's even a positive thing, because that way it won't be bloated with useless content. But at the same time, you also need to make sure that you get to do everything, and that that hour of content has everything that it needs to be a satisfying conclusion, not only to this 30-hour game, but to this entire saga. It needs to be exciting, it needs to be worthwhile, but that's not really what it is. Ragnarok starts off outside of Asgard, where you're fighting normal enemies that you've been fighting for the whole game. You fight your way through these enemies to get closer to the wall of Asgard. When you reach the wall of Asgard, you're fighting more normal enemies. Then you head in through the wall, you fight more normal enemies. Then you fight Thor again, because it's a rematch from the first boss in the game. Then you fight Odin, and it's over. Visually, it looked really cool, but gameplay-wise, it was extremely lackluster, especially because this is a freaking God of War game. But the final war of this saga is mostly just fighting some normal mobs. What about the fight between Thor and Jormungandr? What about fighting through the city of Asgard itself? What about having more to do than just fighting two gods? Why was Surtur barely a thing? Why was Fenrir just running around in the background with Angerboda on his back? All of these things have been set up throughout the game, throughout the saga. They were set up to be major events, but here they're literally just some background decoration. Especially Thor versus Jormungandr. This fight has been set up in 2018 to be a battle so massive that they broke the fucking world's tree. They broke the foundation of this universe. It sent the snake flying back through time, which caused us to meet him in 2018. And in Ragnarok, it just happens in the background while you're busy killing normal enemies. They could have done so much with that one battle by just involving the player. How can you have an event like Ragnarok inside of a God of War game and not have Kratos involved in all of the major fights? Why are we as a player fighting normal mobs while we can look at the spectacle in the background? You can have Kratos fighting Thor on the snake, similar to how you fight Baldur on the dragon in 2018. Have them tear through the city or something, which could give the battle and the war a much bigger scale. Everyone was expecting a crazy fight from this, and I can't blame them. Even if the newer games are more story and character focused, the core of the spectacle should always be there. It was also still there in 2018. The final boss of that game was you fighting Baldur on top of a reanimated corpse of a giant controlled by Freya. So why was the final boss of Ragnarok fighting Thor in the front garden followed by fighting Odin in his basement? Even when comparing it to some boss fights from this game itself, the final boss was far from the most memorable one. I would honestly argue that the very first boss of the game is actually the highlight. Which is a shame, because a lot of the spectacle that makes God of War was just missing in Ragnarok of all things. So yeah, I kind of went on a bit of a rant there, but Ragnarok was pretty disappointing, even if what was there story-wise was pretty alright. Thor was fantastic, both his story conclusion and his boss fight. It was a lot better than the final fight against Odin, and visually the war also did look really cool. It really felt like you were running through a battlefield. But there was just so much set up throughout the saga that leads to absolutely nothing. At most it leads to background decoration while you're just fighting the same enemies that you've been fighting throughout this 40 to 30 hour game. And for a finale of not only a God of War game, but for the finale to this saga, I think it's pretty fair to want a bit more. Moving on from Ragnarok though, the final thing that I wanted to talk about story-wise is the continuity between the two games, since if we're being honest, it is kind of a mess. Parts of this I can kind of overlook because I like the end results, but that can't be said about all of them, especially because there are signs of what could have been. I'll start with the one that I don't really mind though, being Thor's character, because while I really like his character in Ragnarok, I think he's fantastic. He's just not the Thor that was set up in 2018, because that game mentions him a lot and the stories about him are absolutely ruthless. We even see this through Modi, his son, because in 2018 you of course fight both of his sons Magni and Modi. We kill Magni and Modi manages to get away, only for later in the game we meet Modi again, but he's on the brink of death because his father beat him. He called his son a failure and almost killed him for it. While in Ragnarok we meet a Thor that always wants the best for his family, but he doesn't know how to act. He's a struggling man, but his family's safety is and will always be his first priority. I can't imagine that guy beating his son to death. These are two different characters in my opinion, and it makes me curious for what Ragnarok could have been if we had the original Thor. But again, don't get me wrong, I really love this version of Thor. He's probably one of my favorite characters in this game, as he also has a complete story arc, but if they wanted God of War to have this version of Thor, they should have shown that version in 2018 as well. And that's of course not the only example, but it's probably one of the most obvious ones. Another example would be that all of the murals which we found at the end of God of War 2018 have been completely retconned. Specifically the mural at the very end of the game, you know, the one that showed Kratos' death. I'm not gonna do a full breakdown on how the mural is different and how the mural is a clear sign of the main story of Ragnarok drastically changing during development. The internet is full of videos that can explain it a lot better than me, but I still wanted to mention it here, especially because this mural was like the main topic of basically every single theory video after 2018, and it's really sad to see that they just completely changed it. All of the speculation was for nothing because the mural isn't even the same anymore. In some games you can argue that continuity isn't the end-all be-all, but for a game like God of War, where they decided to focus on the story, it's pretty fucking important. But all of this, or at least most of it, can be pretty easily explained. As I mentioned a few times already, this game is two games mashed into one. Not only was the saga originally a trilogy, but many plot points were changed during the development, either because of creative differences or because while stepping down from their 3-game plan, they wouldn't have the time to explore all of the plot points that they had planned out. I don't want to go into the development too much in this video, I more so want to talk about the game that we got, the end result. Plans often change, especially in game development, but it is still pretty interesting, so I didn't want to not mention it at all. The reason for why they switched from a trilogy to duology is that games these days just take too long to make, and they didn't want to have this story span over 15 years, which would be pretty likely if they did make 3 games. And while that is a fair point, working on one story for 15 years could be pretty draining creatively, but they must have known that before starting development, right? Like, why plan this entire trilogy, release the first part, and then be like, actually, no, this is gonna take too long, let's just end it with the next game. Like, I get it, but it's also a bit, I don't know, it could have been handled better, I feel like. Especially because there's no way that this is the actual ending either. Which ties back into what I was saying in the intro segment. both the main game and the DLC have some pretty major plot points left without conclusion. For example, the main game ends with Atreus setting out on a journey to find the giants, and the DLC ends with Mimir's halting with Sigrun. And these are pretty major things. The problem isn't that their character arcs aren't over yet, it's more that they've set themselves yet another goal to fulfill within the Norse lands. Like, of course, this game wasn't going to be the end of Atreus, but since it is supposed to be a conclusion to the Norse saga, why is his next arc so intrinsically Norse? And with Mimir as well in a way, he isn't leaving on a journey or anything, but Sigrun is. And Mimir is kinda just sticking around. We don't really know what Mimir is going to be doing next. Is he planning on waiting for Sigrun in the Norse lands, or is he going to be joining us for the next mythology? Is he a mainstay God of War character now? We kind of just have no idea, because we just have no idea what's gonna happen next. There is so much that's just unknown. We don't know what the next saga is gonna be, and we don't even know what's left for this one. Are we gonna get more Mimir? Are we gonna get more Sindri maybe? Are we gonna get more Freya and Angrboda? Like, we probably should, but we don't know, and I feel like this is a very strange feeling to have after playing the so-called conclusion. Now, of course, they have started releasing post-game content with God of War Ragnarök Valhalla, that is a very long name, but that DLC is providing more closure to, for example, Kratos' role in this land and the whole Tyr situation, but this shouldn't have been post-game content, especially since they wanted to end the saga with Ragnarök. That's the whole reason of why Ragnarök is 2 games mashed into one. That's why they rushed this trilogy into a duology, to end the saga so they can pave the way for the next one, but they just didn't. So now I'm just wondering why? Going back to that Atreus and Angrboda plotline, this might age pretty badly, but I'm pretty confident that they're gonna release a smaller scale Atreus game, similar to Spider-Man Miles Morales or Uncharted The Lost Legacy. They kind of have to. They have the perfect plot set up for Atreus to do one final venture into this mythology, while also setting up the next thing. But if that happens, and if the plot points that I mentioned earlier are resolved in the Atreus game, then we still have a trilogy. But instead of 3 full games that fully explore all of their ideas and concepts, we'll have one game, God of War 2018, one game that's 2 games mashed together into one, God of War Ragnarök, then we'll have a DLC expansion, God of War Ragnarök Valhalla, and then we'll either have one smaller scale Atreus game, or one really big God of War Ragnarök expansion. So again, I'm asking, why? Why didn't they just stick to the original 3-game plan? I feel like a lot of the content that they're doing now and a lot of the plot threads that they're addressing now in this post-Ragnarök content, stuff like Kratos facing his past more directly, accepting the title of being a God of War again, Atreus looking for the giants, Sigrun and Mimir's relationship. I feel like these were all plotlines that were originally supposed to be part of the trilogy, because this stuff was set up throughout the whole saga, but now it's just being executed in this weird post-game DLC content because they stepped away from the original trilogy idea, but these are still ideas that they wanna explore. There's just so much more that should have happened. The first game set up so many things just for the sequel to brush it aside or to address it now in the post-game, literally years later. This could have been a masterpiece of a trilogy that addressed all of these things in a natural way, but Ragnarök tried to do too much in one game, making everything kind of just fall apart. And the fact that we're doing all of these plotlines now in post-game content does prove this. Of course, I'm not as satisfied as I should be after playing Ragnarök, after playing the finale, because it simply isn't the finale that they promised, it's just part of it. God of War Ragnarök was part of the finale, God of War Ragnarök Valhalla is another part, and whatever is next will be yet another. In time, I'm sure that I'll have the conclusion that I wanted for this saga. I'll know how the plotline with the giants and Atreus went, I'll know the conclusion or what's next for Mimir, Angrboda, and Freya. I'll know who blew the horn and why, and all of the plot threads will be cleaned up nicely. But that's simply them going back and righting their wrongs. Those are the things that should have happened in Ragnarök, not now, a year or more later after release. the damage has been done. I played Ragnarok and it wasn't what they promised, and that's why I just didn't feel satisfied by the time that I was looking at the credits. But so far in this video, I've mainly been focusing on my gripes with the story content, but it is of course still a game, so there is a lot more content in here than just the story. But similarly to the story, a lot of it also just feels strangely implemented and poorly contextualized, if we're talking about the side stuff and the open worlds. There is so much to explore in this game. All of the realms are open and explorable, most of them even having an open world, some of them even having multiple, and that many times the game will tell you to go out and explore this world. Sometimes it's Kratos, sometimes Atreus. We'll end a main mission, or during a main mission, they'll just say, hey, why don't we take a break right now and look around this area for a bit, find some loot. But it rarely feels like this is the right time or even place to have an explorable mini open world filled with side content. Yeah, I guess we are preparing for Ragnarok, so maybe we could use the materials. But we're also being chased by Odin to the point that we need a hideout in between the realms so he can't find us. The realms themselves are on the brink of falling apart. Ragnarok, the end of the world, is coming, and we're just on a stroll through Midgar, raiding a random bandit camp, challenging a random spirit boss, or helping this NPC for no real reason, it seems. Of course, it does work at times, especially early on, but usually it feels awkward, out of place, out of character even, and just like filler content. It feels like they just put in open worlds everywhere because 2018 had one open area, so the way to expand that is by having more and larger open areas. But God of War 2018 wasn't necessarily your classic Ubisoft open world or anything like that. It was more a linear story that was set in open spaces with side content to strengthen that main story, to help deliver the core message. While this open world feels a lot more like your classic open world game. That's not to say all of the side content is bad though. Since I'm a completionist, I couldn't help myself and I still did a fair amount of side content. And there are some really great quests in here. Quests like the Mimir quest with the chained beast, or the jellyfish quest in the desert, but these quests are rather rare and spread out between other quests, like this one where you need to find this dog's favorite toy. Outside of the actual side stories that I just mentioned, which are a bit longer, there are also the smaller and quicker fetch quests, and while these aren't that bad, they're just your regular fetch quests, and there aren't an egregious amount of them, it just feels like we didn't really need them in this game, as they do more harm than good. Like, if you really want to add an open world with side content to this game, why not just leave the few high quality side stories that I mentioned earlier, and just get rid of the rest? Same thing with the other side activities, they simply don't serve a purpose outside of gameplay. Like, why would Kratos go through the Muspelheim challenges a second time after canonically doing them in 2018? In that game, the challenges were bonding time with his son, while also training him, getting him ready for the future, which is another reason for their journey. But here, it's just a thing, because 2018 had a combat arena, so I guess Ragnarok should have it too. I'm not saying that they can't include it, but at least make it work within the context of this world. It's especially a massive downgrade compared to how 2018 handled side content. With the general pacing of that game, these things also didn't really feel out of place. You're just on a journey as Kratos who wants to grow closer to his son. He wants to teach him things and create a father-son bond. And what better way to do that than to explore this world and to spend time together? Atreus has also never left the forest before, so he's curious about everything. He wants to see everything. And since you're not working on the deadline of the end of the world, it's okay to get sidetracked sometimes. It's okay to explore and give in to his curiosity. The Norse realm was also a completely new land with new lore and myths, not only to us but also to our characters. So every time that Atreus wanted to explore because the world would open up more in that game, I wanted to explore as well. I wanted to know what was going on here. The open world in that game also just felt a lot more natural, as it wasn't a forced area in every single realm. It was just the Lake of Nine, a central location that you would often return to. Your actions in the story would open up this world more and more, and since that story had a lot of downtime, why not check out the new areas while we're here anyway? The side quests as well serve as a vessel to explore this world, and besides for for the general world building, they also give the characters a pretty good plotline to react to, or they give them something to think about and talk about that's relevant to their character and their arc in the game, which also made them a lot more memorable in my opinion. The world wasn't too big, it had things to do outside of the story, but it wasn't too much. It wasn't distracting, and while the game would sometimes tell you to do them, it never felt forced. You could ignore it and continue on the story path, no problem, or you could take a break and explore, that was also no problem. It wouldn't mess with your enjoyment or the pacing in any way, and it also wasn't overwhelming at all. I know that I've basically just been praising 2018 side content for the past handful of minutes or so, but those are just the things that I was missing in Ragnarok. Everything that I just praised about 2018, Ragnarok was missing. And considering that Ragnarok is a sequel, it's really sad to see that they just downgraded in a lot of ways. But despite all of the negatives that I just named, there's a reason for why I originally really loved this game. There's a reason why a lot of people still call it a 10 out of 10 masterpiece, and why it's only over time that I started to notice the cracks. And that's because there are a lot of things in this game that are genuinely downright fantastic. Like, the opening hours are incredible. The chase with Freya, the death of Fenrir, the battle against the bear who turned out to be Atreus, meeting Odin and Thor, the boss fight with Thor, the reintroduction to Brock and Sindri who introduce us to our new hub in their house between the realms. The game has a fantastic opening. It establishes the plot perfectly, it sets up the characters and how they've grown and changed in subtle ways. It reintroduces us to this world, it shows how the game has evolved, not only as a story, but as a game, by showcasing a lot of new enemy types, new finishing moves, new mini-bosses, new bosses. It sets up our antagonists, and it's all done naturally. There is a lot in these opening few hours, but the game takes its time. It has constant small moments in between to subtly set things up, and all the while it still has these incredibly tense moments, it has these emotional moments. It has unexpected twists and a fantastic action set piece like the boss fight with Thor. And while the game doesn't keep this up for the entirety of its run, there are definitely still things here to love. I named a lot of negatives earlier, but there are a lot of things that are just done beautifully. The arc that Kratos and Atreus go on, they might stumble the writing a few times on the way, but they have a pretty good progression throughout, and I absolutely adore where the game puts them in the end in terms of their character. As much as I felt conflicted during the end coming right out of Ragnarok, that final scene of Kratos and Atreus had me in tears. It was basically perfect, much like the beginning was, and Kratos' past was also handled really well. How he talks about his brother at points, how he talks about all of the things that he's been through that make him into who he is today. Same thing with the snippets that we see from Faye. I like that we saw more of her, but at the same time we didn't see everything. Stuff like their meeting or even how Kratos came to these lands is still shrouded in mystery, and that's how it should be. And the way that Kratos' journey continued in the Valhalla DLC is incredible. Putting aside what I was saying earlier about God of War Ragnarok should have just been the conclusion, and we shouldn't be getting main story beats like this in the DLC because it kinda defeats the point of, you know, Ragnarok being the conclusion. Putting all that aside, because I have talked about that more than enough, the DLC itself was just great. I already loved where Ragnarok left Kratos as a character, but Valhalla only strengthened that by having him confront his past more directly. It worked both as a great piece of character writing, showing how far he's come, but it also worked because just seeing that scene play out as a long-term God of War fan was so amazing that words kind of just can't describe it. That scene was just unreal. Especially because while it can be seen as fan service, it also just worked as a great piece of writing, as a great character moment, which is of course what's most important. And side character wise, while a lot of them definitely deserved more, a lot of the major side characters did have some genuinely fantastic moments. As I said before, Thor might have not been what I expected, or he might have not even been what they were setting up for him, but I thought he was absolutely fantastic. Brock and Sindri too, finding out more about their past was really cool, even if it was handled in a bit of a weird way, just having them drop it during gameplay. This is again something that I mean with the game handling main plot points like a checklist. Like, this reveal could have been so much more than Sindri just randomly dropping it to you. It felt really awkward and out of place, but I was gonna talk about the positives, and the rest of this plot point, this subplot, is done in a really good way, because while the reveal is a bit underwhelming, the rest of it plays out fantastically. It has some great scenes, and some of these scenes are even some of my favorite scenes of the whole game, like the scene where Brock has to bless the spear for Kratos. And later his death was heartbreaking, especially when you see what it does to Sindri. And talking about Brock's death, the whole Tyr plot twist was also fantastic. It's done in a way that you wouldn't be able to guess it beforehand, but once you know what's going on, so many things just click into place and it makes so much sense. It's also a great way to introduce Odin as a villain. In 2018, they always talked about how manipulative he is and how he tricks everyone, but now we've been experiencing it ourselves throughout the whole game firsthand. Angrboda was also a really cool character. I don't have too much to say about her, I just really enjoyed her as a character, and her relationship with Atreus was a lot of fun to watch. I don't know, she was just charming. I'm also pretty excited to see her again in the Atreus game, which is probably coming out at some point. Same thing goes for Mimir. He didn't really have a major role in this game, but considering his situation, he did have a lot of screen time, and even if he didn't play a major role in the main story, he was just a very enjoyable character to have around. Sometimes they do use him to over-explain stuff to you, as I'll touch on in a bit, but as Kratos and Atreus started to have some trouble in their father-son relationship, it was really nice to see the friendship of Mimir and Kratos develop. There's not that much to say about this, but I did want to point that out, as Mimir as a character has been a great addition in this saga. Again, especially the way that he's integrated into Kratos' character arc of him finding a new family, and Mimir has definitely become a part of that family. And this might not be a major character, but I also really like the whole Fenrir thing. It being set up from the beginning, then meeting the wolf in Helheim, that boss fight, and ultimately giving that wolf the soul of Fenrir was a fantastic sequence, followed by another one of my favorite scenes, this talk between Kratos and Atreus, showing their growth from the first game while also mirroring the "be better" line, was perfect. There is so much subtle character work going on in this one scene. The same thing when they revisit Alfheim and Kratos is drawn to the light because of what happened in the previous game. These scenes take their time and they show the characters just do their thing. They're showing their feelings, their emotions, their thoughts, and they're all doing it naturally and subtly, and it's just really good. But these scenes are maybe half of the scenes in the game, because there are so many moments where the subtlety is just thrown out of the window. Like, let's take Heimdall's death for a moment, because this scene is visually really strong. The use of camera angles, the way that the audio is mixed, the facial expressions, they tell you everything you need to know. What is happening right now is kinda messed up, and Kratos shouldn't be doing this. But then they also felt the need to have Mimir say stuff like, "No, Kratos, stop, Kratos! Kratos, you don't want this, Kratos, you need to stop!" And then Heimdall goes, "Ah, Kratos, you're a monster for doing this." And even after killing Heimdall, Mimir has to repeat again, "Ah, Kratos." That wasn't it, was it? Like, why is that necessary? Compared to the other scenes that I mentioned earlier, like Helheim or Alfheim, they didn't need the characters to spell everything out. They didn't need the characters to tell you, "Oh, the "be better" line, I remember when you said that to me in the last game." They didn't point this stuff out, and that's why it worked. It worked because it was so subtle. And this scene is just something completely different. Not in the way that they're a different scene, because of course they're a different scene. They're just written in such a different way. Now, neither of these scenes are bad, though, don't get me wrong. It's just that it's so inconsistent. And that is really frustrating, and that's exactly what I meant earlier with the game is fighting with itself in how it's written, how it wants to portray things, and even what it wants to focus on. And talking about the game fighting with itself, the combat in this game is pretty good though. That was such a dumb transition, but I'm just gonna go with it. My main criticism in 2018 was basically all connected to the combat. Not the combat itself, but more the variety in both enemy types, finishing moves, and combat abilities. Because you do fight the same troll over and over again, and Kratos only has a handful of finishing animations. But here, all of that is fixed. You still have your axe, you have the Blades of Chaos, and later in the game you get a spear. And all of those weapons feel unique and satisfying. I was especially pleasantly surprised by the spear. I did not see that weapon coming, and it was an awesome throwback to the original games. The enemy variety was also a lot better. Not only having more diverse bosses, but also mini-bosses and normal mobs had a lot more going on. Another thing that they added, which was a really nice surprise, even though you could kinda guess it was coming, was a playable Atreus. His combat style felt super unique, but it was also really satisfying to play, and while you only use him for certain sections, it was really in-depth, and it was just a lot of fun. I also really liked that you had different sidekicks with you instead of always just having Atreus. Like Brock or Sindri or Freya or Angerboda, all of them would join you at certain sections, and it would just be cool to have a different party member with you since they all do act differently. Oh, and also the added platforming elements were really cool. It wasn't a lot, but just grappling with the Chaos Blades and having more movement options was really nice. The main thing gameplay-wise that I didn't really like here though, and I also didn't like it in 2018, is just the stat bullshit. I don't care if my armor piece has plus 5% poison resistance. I just think it's all pretty dumb, and I really hope that the next saga gets rid of this. Some RPG elements are fine, I like the skill tree, I like the armor sets, but I don't care about plus 2% defense. And as a final point, there is one more thing that I just have to mention, as God of War Ragnarok did win a very specific award in 2022, the award for Best OST, so I couldn't not mention it. Personally, I also really like the OST, it's from the same composer as God of War 2018, so of course it was gonna be good, especially the main theme and the Atreus theme. They're both perfect and very epic. Atreus theme I do really want to highlight. It's called A Sun's Path, and it honestly gave me shivers whenever it played during the game. As I said earlier, for as many problems that I had with Ragnarok, there are those moments that I do adore. Those moments where everything clicked and where it did feel like a special experience. And those tracks did really help with that. There's also another reason why I really wanted to mention the OST and it winning that award, and that is because when it won the award, it also made a lot of Xenoblade fans extremely salty, including one of my friends who I think still hasn't gotten over it. Personally, I don't really care whether or not it's won. I just think it's really funny how salty some people got over it, so I just wanted to mention it to bring some salt back. But that's basically everything that I wanted to talk about in regards to God of War Ragnarok. To go back to the main point of this video though, and why I even made it in the first place, what do I think of this game? Well, I think it's pretty alright. The game obviously has a lot of flaws, as I've not been shying away from, but I think that a lot of the flaws aren't really that detrimental. Like, yeah, the game obviously isn't perfect, there are a lot of plotlines that have been rushed through, a lot of ideas that haven't been fleshed out, there are a lot of retcons, some characters just kinda suck, there's some very inconsistent writing, there's a lot of build-up for things that completely fell flat, a lot of things also just don't get build-up, and the open world isn't really implemented that naturally. Same thing with some other side content, and they also fail to deliver on the promise of concluding the Norse arc of our characters. But at the same time, while it is messy, it wasn't really bad. Personally, I think that a lot of my problems just come from the fact that 2018 was so much better. This game is still a pretty good game. It delivers on the character arc of Kratos and Atreus, it does a great job with Thor and some of the other side characters, it has some incredible moments, it has those moments that will stay with me forever, and the music was great, the voice acting was phenomenal, it felt great to play and it was just really fun, but as a whole package, as a whole game, as an experience, it just didn't feel as consistent or as special to me as God of War 2018, where everything in that game was carefully crafted to give you the best experience. It only had an open world section where it felt natural. They took their time with the characters. Hell, they took God of War, this God of War, and turned it into a character-driven narrative while still keeping the core intact. That's not easy to do. So they had to take their time with it. They had to carefully craft all of it. But with this game, they decided to turn two games into one midway through development. So of course the focus will be a bit of a mess. But there are still pieces of a great game in here. When I started writing this video, I was maybe a bit too focused on the messy parts, which is why this video is very front-loaded with my criticisms. But as I was writing the script and as I was looking at the footage, I was reminded of the great moments as well. I was reminded of my first experience with this game, where I did have those moments of, fuck, this is something special. Especially if we include Valhalla. And I think that that sums it up nicely. This game is a bit of a mess, but I don't regret playing it at all. I still had a great time with it, and while yeah, it did disappoint me at moments, I was still really enjoying myself at others. All in all, I don't think it's a masterpiece. I don't think it gets close to 2018, but that doesn't mean it's bad, it's still pretty good. In the end, I guess this is just the end result of a saga where 2018 was the first part of a trilogy and Ragnarok was forced to be the second part of a duology. If you made it up to this point in the video, I really want to say thank you so much for watching. It genuinely means a lot to me. Making this video, I'm gonna be honest, kind of a mess. If you've been following me on Twitter or on YouTube, you might know that I originally wanted to have it out last year already, in November, for the first anniversary of the game, so that definitely didn't work out. Partly because God of War Valhalla just got announced as I was like in the editing process. Then the end of year videos came around, some pre-release discussions, which just made me push back the video a lot of times. It made me rewrite parts of the script, re-edit, re-record. So because it was such a mess, I really just wanted to have this little message at the end to say thank you. At points, I wasn't even sure if I was gonna finish this video because of all the stuff that I mentioned just now. I was like, do I really want to do this? But I've put months of my time into this. So in the end, I was like, yeah, you know what? I put a lot of time into this. I am gonna make it. And now we're here. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. It's not perfect, I know that. Maybe it's a bit front-loaded with criticisms, but in a way that's also just how I approached making this video. Because as I said in the beginning, I entered this video thinking, I don't know if I even like this game. I have so many criticisms and it's hard to see the positives. But as I was working on the video, I was like, you know what, there are definitely positives here. And while it's maybe a bit of a weird video structure, it does kind of reflect the journey that I went on making this video. So while it's definitely not perfect, I'm proud of how it turned out, and I hope that you guys did enjoy it as well. But I feel like I'm starting to ramble a little bit, because I don't have a script for this part. I really just wanted to sit down, say thank you, and just ramble a bit about my thoughts on this video and the creation process, because these videos can be very scripted, and because of that maybe not feel as personal, so I do want to bring in this little connection between you and me, the viewer. I don't know what I'm doing. Oh, be sure to leave a comment with your thoughts on the game, because when I started this video, I was really like, I don't like this game, and another part of why I was kind of thinking about not making the video, I was like, I'm alone in thinking this. But while researching for this video, I actually found a lot of people that agreed with me, so I'm super curious to just hear more opinions on God of War Ragnarok, because maybe it's not as universally loved as I originally thought. So be sure to let me hear your thoughts. Maybe you thought this video is full of shit and you do think it's a masterpiece, or maybe I brought up some good points that made you go, I love this game. He has a point there, which was kind of the goal, in a way, I guess. I don't know, again, I'm rambling, I'm sorry, I'm gonna end it off here. Be sure to leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to my channel and all of that stuff. Again, leave a comment with your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching, I really hope you enjoyed, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.